Maybe your financial ship finally came in, and when it did, you were at the airport cutting a deal on this, or this, or maybe even something like this. Well, tap the brakes because your insurance company may have other plans for you. And the truth is we've been reporting in Aviation Consumer and over its sister publication, Planes Magazine, the aviation insurance market has taken a hardened turn. It's left a lot of airplane owners with either non-renewal of their policies or rates that are a lot higher than they've ever seen. Now, to try to get a handle on what's going on here, we rounded up a few of the aviation insurance industry's most respected and experienced professionals for an insurance roundtable discussion. Now, I was supposed to do this at AirVenture this past summer at one of the forum areas, but obviously that didn't work, so we're doing it via Zoom. We've got Marcy Veroni at Avemco. We've got Scott Smith from Sky Smith Specialty Insurance. We've got John Doolittle from Sutton James Optisure in Hartford, Connecticut. Here's a candid discussion. Scott, we'll start with you. Click on your website and in bright red, bold text, it basically echoes what we've been hearing at the magazine, and that's that things are changing in the aircraft insurance market, from rates to insurability of older pilots. Why don't you kick it off and tell us what you're seeing from your perch?
Well, and that's why we put the disclaimer, I guess, on the website, is that things have changed. And this started way before COVID, so it wasn't even COVID. It was the increase in rates and the increase in requirements by underwriting and the changes in their underwriting guidelines through whatever data they use or whatever reasons. And there's been all kinds of stories. We've heard things, as a broker, we've heard all the different reasons that the increases happen and all the changes happen. We've seen it. The rates have went up. I tell people 30 to 300%. It's not typically that big, but at the same time, we've had some big rate increases for some of our customers. And they've had unique circumstances that caused it, but that's not the only, and they're not the only ones. I mean, I had a Cardinal that had a gear up, that had an open claim, and the current insurer decided they didn't really want it, but no one else would take it, and they increased him from $1,200 to $5,000. So huge increase. He had a bank. He has no options. He's stuck with that to pay it because he couldn't pay the airplane off. It felt bad for him, and it's a huge increase, but that's not the normal. And then we've had the problems with pilots that are old, and it's and I've been at the aviation insurance since '85. And started when I was in my 30s and going to the air shows and going building my book of business. I've got a lot of customers I've had from the beginning. Those guys are in their 70s, some of them in their 80s. And those people are running into some problems, and they're saying, what are we going to do? Why can't I get more quotes? How come I only got one renewal quote? Why didn't I get somebody else? And we tell them, we quote everybody but Avemco. Thanks, Marcy. And we send them to Avemco and say, try them if you can get something from there. And actually, recently we did that. We just sent somebody and he got it from Avemco because I couldn't get him anything better than what he wanted with our market. And it makes it difficult, but that's kind of what we've seen. We do a lot of experimental aircraft, which is probably more of my market. I probably half my business experimental airplanes. Did a lot of vans, a lot of glass airs, a lot of unique things. I did all the comp airs. So I've had a level one of a kind experience to try to go get it. Well, that whole has changed because what we used to be able to do and get an underwriter to sit down and underwrite a unique one of a kind airplane has gotten very difficult. Most of the underwriters and the companies that did that for me have now all went computerized, and if it doesn't fit the system, they don't want to quote it. So it's changed how we market everything. And I do seminars around the country on buying airplanes and owning airplanes. And one of the things I do is I throw out aviation insurance. Say, look, if you're going to buy an airplane, think about the insurance, because if you have to buy insurance, you got to be careful what you buy. And that's been kind of why we put that big logo up there and said, hey, be careful. Things are changing. Don't be surprised. We're going to try to do everything we can, but it's going to be a unique experience. It's a tough one to follow up.
Yeah. John Doolittle, how about you? You've been at this a long time there at Sutton James in Hartford. What do you see?
I see the same things I think that Scott does. One of the biggest problems with having been in the business for 30 years and having had loyal customers for 30 years is that all of a sudden they're 80 years old. And
yeah,
all of a sudden the market has taken one of its cycles, and it's really hard to get stuff done. Really hard to get I think we're going to be down when we're down to 300, when we're down to no pilots at all, because they're all getting so old. We'll still have 300,000 airplanes registered, I think. But yeah, I would say the market swing is catching the old pilot thing. And between the two of them, it's making it very hard to get people, especially people who want higher limits of liability. Very tough to get them renewal. And we generally, with our guys, we start talking to them when they're 58, 60 about a long-term home. The insurance companies are looking for long-term customers. And they don't want somebody who changes companies every year for a few bucks. They want the guy that's going to stick with them. And, you know, sooner or later, they're going to come to a point where either they quit flying on their own or an insurance company is going to make them. So in order to stretch that as far as we can, we generally sit down with them each year and say, look, here's the company that we recommend. It's a little bit more now, but if you're going to stay in that airplane for 5 more years, we think this is the best shot at getting insurance for you every year.
Marcy, how about you from your perch there at Avemco?
I have to say that I too am hearing what John and Scott are talking about, but here at Avemco, it's business as usual. And we haven't changed our guidelines, we haven't changed our underwriting philosophy, and we haven't changed our prices. So we are able to hold on to our book, and we are taking on some new clients because we're getting a lot of calls saying, hey, my agent said to give you a call. But with that said, I also have to protect the folks that have been loyal to us and have been with us for 30 and 40 years. I too started in 86, and I have customers that, you know, we've grown old together, and they're the backbone of our company, and they're the reason why we're still here. And so we haven't really participated because we are direct. We haven't played the pricing game at all. The price is the price, the guidelines are the guidelines, and that's why we've been doing this for 60 years.
Why are older pilots seemingly being targeted, higher rates and, you know, all the issues that we're talking about? And, you know, it's easy to say, well, I'm going to dive into the NTSB reports and try to see if older pilots are bending airplanes more now than they have ever, because the types of accidents that any pilot, particularly an older one, might be involved with may not make the NTSB reports. We're talking gear up landings, maybe loss of control where the airplane goes off the runway and into the weeds, it gets banged up. Those types of crashes may not end up in the NTSB reports. So I guess the long and the short of it is you may not get a true picture of what's going on with older pilots by looking at NTSB reports. So the question for each of you is, why do you think older pilots are being sort of singled out here? And Marcy, you sort of touched upon it with the fact that you're trying to protect your existing clients. Scott, what do you think?
You know, I don't know that there is any kind of study out there that shows it. I've talked to underwriters, and they've given me feedback that said, oh, well, we've had a lot of losses with ground loops in old tailwheel airplanes with older pilots. They haven't specified that they've got a study that says that. That's the underwriter saying, you know, the specific one. He says, well, we've done a lot of payoffs because they aren't flying, you know, every 2-3 months they go out and take the airplane out. They're a little slower on their skills. I don't think there's real proof. There may be actuarial data that we don't have access as a broker. I don't have access to that and don't really want it. But so there may be some sort of actuarial data there saying it. But there's also, we had a Mooney with a company who, when the guy, a little Mooney too, M20, when the guy turns 70 this year, they require him to have a co-pilot in the airplane. And I called the underwriter and said, when did this happen? And he said, well, just this year we've started that we feel that since they're 70, they need a co-pilot in the airplane qualified. And I said, that was crazy. We had another quote for him, which was substantially higher. Of course, they were very cheap. And that apparently was why they wanted, maybe cheap's the wrong word, they were very low priced. And that's probably why they were requiring the second pilot, where the other companies weren't, and they were higher priced. So yeah, and it's a very difficult thing. This pilot thing is, there's been cycles in aviation insurance and aviation throughout the years. I mean, we had high interest rates for a while, then you have high fuel rates, you have all these things that cycle up and down, but we never had the pilot problem, I don't think, because most of our young pilots were coming in from building their hours and going to the airlines. And now we've lost a lot of pilots. And of course, now during COVID, we don't have the airlines flying as much as they used to. There was a huge demand for pilots before COVID started. So I think there was a potential to get some new life into the system. But through those cycles, we still had pilots in their 50s and 60s all the time. Now we're seeing pilots in their 70s and 80s, and that's a lot of our pilots. And we're not getting the new blood in like we used to. And it kind of scares me from the marketing side is, well, what are the underwriters, I want to say, what are the underwriters thinking? We got COVID when nobody's flying. We've got all these pilots that aren't coming into this, into the industry, the young pilots. And now you're hitting on the older pilots. What are you doing? Why are you picking on them? And there's still a lot of pilots that probably, I'm early 60, and there's people that are probably better shape than I am in their 70s and late 70s, and way better pilots than I am. So how do they rationalize that? I don't know. But it's a problem I think we're going to run into over the next year or two.
Yeah. John, you've got a loyal client base, folks that you've been brokering for a lot of years, and you've seen your clients upgrade airplanes. What are you seeing as they get older and maybe upgrade airplanes to higher performance, maybe some turbines? What are you seeing from your older clients?
Well, to go back just to the old pilot thing for just a second, if you think about it from the underwriter's point of view, and Marcy won't have any trouble with this, of course. There are 70-year-old guys who can fly as well as they could when they're in their 20s. And there are other 70-year-old guys who shouldn't be allowed to drive automobiles. The problem is if you're an underwriter sitting in an office building in Atlanta or New York or Houston or wherever, you don't know which is which. You don't know if you have the guy that plays tennis 3 times a week or the guy that just had a stroke. But both of them are in Cessna 210s. Which would you underwrite? And that's what they're faced with. In the face of that, they all sort of take the position, well, we should keep away from that kind of business because it has a lot of loss potential.
Marcy, at Avemco, are you seeing an older pilot breaking airplanes more now than before, or what are you seeing from aging pilots as far as claims?
I'm going to kind of piggyback on Scott. I am the underwriter. I do have the data, and next year we'll be in business 60 years. I have 60 years of data that tells me a senior pilot 60 years ago is doing the same thing that a senior pilot's doing today. And so, insurance is the law of large numbers. How many of them are out there for us to spread the risk around? And anybody younger than 20, older than 70, whether you're flying an airplane or driving a car, you're going to see an increase in the rate. I'm not seeing 70-year-old people, have ground loops more than 20-year-old people. I'm seeing people that are flying tail draggers have ground loops. And then you add or delete based on what you're seeing as a whole. So we're lucky there. So the answer is no. I'm not any more than I've seen for the last 33 years I've been with Avemco.
Well, let's take that one step further. Are you more or less tolerant of those ground loops? So if I'm 50 something years old, if I finally buy my 185 tail dragger and I go out and I ground loop this thing a few times and I bent it a few times, are you more or less tolerant of that type of that type of wreck?
If you have an accident, I'm not going to non-renew you, if that's your question, unless you were, doing something crazy while it happened. If you meet the terms of our policy and you meet the contract terms and you have a claim, I'm going to pay the claim. I may take away your claim-free discount, which if you've been with us for a few years could be as much as 15% of your premium. So that's the answer.
Can I ask you, Marcy?
Yes, sir.
Do you think that it has an effect that maybe there's fewer airplanes flying that are insured that might be changing the number? I mean, we're seeing these numbers and people say, the idea is, well, the rates are up on older pilots. Maybe there's more accidents for older pilots. Maybe it's just the fact that those are the people that are flying. And that's our basis of all of our numbers is more 70-year-old pilots than there is 50-year-old pilots. So it skews the numbers a little bit. It's not that there's more claims. It's just that's where the numbers are. Does that make sense?
I heard you say that we're not getting a lot of folks into aviation, but I can tell you that during COVID, our phones were ringing off the hook with folks that were learning to fly or maybe unable to fly for the airline. So now they were renting airplanes, and we sell a renter policy. And those numbers just really jumped since March. I'm seeing a lot of younger folks coming into the industry. In my other life, I'm immediate past chair for women in aviation, and I'm really happy to say that female pilots have increased 1% first time in over 30 years. So I'm seeing a lot of women, I'm seeing a lot of minorities, and I'm seeing more people come into the industry. So I don't agree with that. No.
Well, and I'm not sure, from my standpoint, we do some non-owned or renters insurance, but we don't do a lot of that. Mine is based on mostly what people are buying. And so we're not seeing the young people buying the airplanes like they were. I can understand people going into aviation, and I've seen that, but I don't see the numbers of people buying airplanes that we used to as new owners because of the younger side. And a lot of that is my son's 30 some years old, and he probably doesn't have the money to go out and buy an airplane or the interest, and I've talked to other people that are saying, well, I'd rather put my money in something else. So there are the diehards that want to get into aviation, but from our side of it, what I'm seeing, you get a lot of people building their first when we're talking kit planes, we get a lot of people building their first airplane and they're 70 years old. They've got time to build. They go out and they buy some little home built that's fairly inexpensive. They're building it in their garage, and now they want to go fly, and they've got 100 hours, and they've had their license for 25 years. We're seeing a lot of that, and you're laughing about that, but we do. We're seeing a guy with 100 to 125 hours who says, "Hey, I built my first Zenith or my Sonics or my Glass Star or whatever it might be, or Vans." And now they want to get insurance, and they're shocked by the rates. And when we tell them, don't build a tail wheel because you're going to have high rates, build a tri-gear, do this, do that, stay away from this. And they say, well, that's my dream airplane. I've been waiting all my life to do it. We're seeing a lot of that kind of stuff. Is that it's not that, so I agree. I don't know that young people aren't getting into it. I don't see the young people for our business buying into it like we did, buying the airplanes we have. We do have young people buying. I just had, you get young people that buy a Cirrus, or they buy something else, or a little 172 to build time in, but it's not like it used to be. But on the other side is we see a lot of old pilots that are coming out of the woodwork. I think the sport or the basic med brought people out of the woodwork where they said, now I can get my license again. I haven't flown for 5 or 7 years. I'm going to go take my medical, and I'm going to go buy that 172, or typically as I'm going to go buy that Baron that I want to get into, and then they jump into the airplane. And that's kind of what we've seen. It's that kind of market. That's a little bit more probably on the kit plane market. We're still seeing people buy 172s and all that kind of stuff. But when you're dealing with the kit plane market, there's a lot of guys that are coming in out of the older age with the time and the money to build what they want to build, and now they're ready to fly and they haven't flown for years.
Is that a problem, and is that getting the attention of the insurance market? The fact that we're flying less and our skills may not be what they used to be.
Oh, definitely. We're seeing some of that. And I've read, that people aren't flying, but our experience has been different. Our phones have increased with especially folks building kit planes. And again, it's all ages, I'm not seeing a huge segment of an older senior pilot group. I'm seeing people in their 30s and 40s building airplanes. Again, I think it's because of COVID, and they're sitting at home and they need something to do. So we sell a kit plane builder policy, and we've sold a lot of those this year.
A pretty lively market in the experimental and home built sector. If somebody is interested in building an experimental or buying an existing experimental, they may not have thought about insurance. We all wander around these air shows and we looking at some of these hot experimental airplanes. Well, insuring it may be a different story. So if you had advice for somebody looking to get into that market, maybe they want to get rid of that Cessna 421 or P210, and finally, they're getting a little bit older, and I want to finally build my own airplane or buy one that somebody's already built. What advice might you have for somebody stepping into that market for the first time?
Well, probably the biggest thing we've run into is that and not talking of Emco, of course, because they'll do their own deal, but with the markets that we use for experimental airplanes, there's a few companies that have retracted and decided not to quote experimental airplanes where they used to. So we're back to a limited number of companies that will take on experimental airplanes. And in that market, there's a limited number that won't take other certain models. So the Lancer 4Ps, those things have become very difficult to insure. Not that you can't, but it'll cost you a lot of money. And it all comes down to the price. I mean, how much money you're willing to spend on a thing. There's certain models of Glasair that a number of companies don't want to insure. Right now, the easiest experimental to insure is probably the Vans series of airplanes. And I relate that to the Cessna and the Piper because it's kind of the Cessna Piper of the experimental market. A lot of airplanes flying, conventional construction. Most of them have Lycoming engines. They're pretty normal. And then once you deviate from that normal, it gets more difficult. And the other side of it's training. When you think about it from our side, we're talking to the underwriters want them to get training. They want them to get some sort of experience in the airplane. If they're building a 1 or 2 airplane design that's only got a very limited production model, who do they get to train them in it? And why would the underwriter want to put them in that airplane if they can't get experience in the airplane? So we run into that. And the Vans has a huge market for that. The Glasairs have done really well for that. The Zeniths have done well for that. Then you get into odd engines in the experimental market. We get a lot of guys who want to, in some airplanes, they'll use Subarus or Vikings or we got Corvairs out there. Now that illuminates a couple of your insurance companies because they don't want the auto conversion engines or things that aren't normal. So in the experimental market, if you think there used to be a guide out, it was like 800 experimental airplanes in the market, and there's probably another 1,000 on top of that are out of production already. And those show up. We've had those show up out of production airplanes. The guy's been building it in his garage for the last 25 years, finally going to get to fly it, and nobody wants to insure it because they don't have any insured. There's no instructors to insure in it, and you almost have to tell them that if you're going to buy an airplane like that or build an airplane, you're on your own for a couple of probably 50 hours before somebody will look at you. And I try to tell people right now, if you don't, and a lot of it's on money, is if you're building this airplane, you don't want to spend a lot of money on insurance, and you're going to buy insurance, buy a fixed tri-gear airplane. That's the best rates that we've found on everything. You can buy a retract, it just gets harder to get insurance, and it's more expensive to insure, and a tail wheel. All right, and when we tell people, when they call, say, look, rates are going up on tail wheels, retracts, and experimentals. And those 3 categories, if you're buying if you're buying an experimental, a nice little slick glass airplane, that's got retracts and a big engine, and it's pressurized, you've opened up a can of worms to get it, especially if you're a 200-hour pilot without an instrument rating. So there's a lot of things that, we try to explain on that. And I think everybody else, all the other brokers are going to do that too, is plan ahead. Do you have an instrument? Do you have retract time? How much money are you willing to spend? Do you have to buy insurance? Because we've got guys that have gone and said, well, I'm just going to buy liability only, and they still can't buy the coverage because they don't have the experience. And there's some airplanes out there, a 500-hour pilot trying to buy a Lancer 4, it's not going to, nobody's going to do that right now. We can't, for us, 1,000 to 1,500 hours minimum for Lancer 4P. And if we get somebody to do it, you're probably looking at $15,000 to do a package on that. And most people just say that I don't want to spend that kind of money. So I tell them, just don't buy that kind of airplane. So it's a tough thing. There's experimentals, I've owned 3 of them. It's a lot of good performance for the money, and that's what people buy. I can build it, I can do my own maintenance, I get a lot of performance for the money. Well, there's a lot of maintenance you can do on a certified airplane. So if there's somebody that comes in and he doesn't know what he wants to buy or build, a lot of times I'll say, have you looked at this as an option? If not, if you really want to do this, just be prepared. You're going to have to get training, you're going to have to do this, you're going to have to do that, and it's going to probably cost you more money.
What are you seeing in the seaplane market?
The rates are pretty high. And my own advice to somebody who's looking to eventually have a 185 or a 206 or whatever would be to start with something that you can insure yourself for physical damage. So buy a Luscombe on floats and buy liability only until you get some time in it. Because otherwise you buy a $250,000 206 on amphibious floats, and it's going to cost you a ton of money to insure it.
We do quite a few like Sportsman's on amphibs and Glass Stars and amphibs, Murphy's, that kind of stuff. It like the 206 is expensive. You know, that's the biggest thing, is how much money do you want to spend? And a lot of these home built seaplanes are coming in at $250,000 to $300,000. And we've actually had some underwriters that have put price limits on. The maximum they'll pay would do is $200,000 or $250,000. So these underwriters are establishing limits, which then has made the owner decide, well, okay, I'm going to have, I guess, my own big deductible. I'm going to have a $100,000 deductible just because I can't get a higher limit. And the training requirements, those kind of things are the same thing too. It's, you know, are you going to do the training? Do you want to put in all the time? And if you're, I think John had the best idea. If you really want to do this, get yourself a cheap little one that you can buy liability only, or don't worry about paying for hull coverage, especially if you build it. Take the risk on it for a while. If you can't take the risk, then maybe it's not what you need to do, because it's going to be an expensive premium.
I agree with John about the seaplane as far as trying to make something affordable. But I think what makes us different when it comes to the seaplane world is, if you do come to me with low time and you're jumping into a seaplane, you are going to pay a much higher rate. However, most of our seaplane operators are New England states, Alaska, Great Lakes area, where it gets really cold and ice, and they may not be able to fly on floats. So we say, hey, call us mid-year. We will re-rate for wheels or skis, and it kind of helps them defray the cost of ownership. And that's, we write a lot of seaplanes that way, because we're flexible and we allow them to go on and off.
What's the turbine market looking like? You know, somebody that's got reasonable amount of time, maybe they've got a lot of piston time coming out of a Baron, maybe a twin Cessna. Scott, you know, maybe somebody going into a used TBM or a Pilatus. What do you think?
Well, we've got our experience with the TBMs and some of the other turbo in the Malibu category, those, you know, the single engine turboprops. Depending on the value, I think the hardest thing that we found is getting the higher limits. You know, that's I think across the board, when you used to be able to get some high liability limits and then high airplane prices. The old ones, we just insured a guy the other day who wanted to buy a 1.5 million TBM, and his current underwriters, and they had 3 airplanes. He had a Baron and 2 Bonanzas, because he's got hours. They wouldn't take him. That company didn't want to insure him in a TBM unless he went under $1 million airplane. So they put a limit on it, and we had to go elsewhere to quote him on that. And it was not reasonable. It's expensive, and the maximum liability limits were fairly low. A lot of people would like to see 5 million or 10 million, and that I think has come down to where, you know, 5 million might be the maximum for owner flown. A lot of the new transition pilots into the TBMs or the older King Airs, or even the Citations, we've been getting hit with $1 million limit, maybe $2 million until they build hours. Biggest problem is trying to get some time. I mean, if you're flying a 421 and using high performance hours, high performance twin, that helps. But we're getting a lot of dual requirements, school requirements, some mentor time requirements. Not bad. I mean, it's all things that are going to be necessary, but it's a shop the market type of thing, because the airplane seems to be an airplane that a lot of underwriters want. At the same time, not everybody wants that pilot. So, you know, we've got to shop a number of different companies to get who isn't necessarily the lowest premium compared to the hours. It kind of depends what you're looking for. If you want less hours, less mentor, less training, you might pay more premium in the beginning. We do turbines and experimentals. Those have become very difficult. There's not as many people want to do a turbine experimental. That's made it a lot. And I think, you know, turbine conversions, you know, Bonanza or a Golden or the 210 with the Allison, you can get them done. It's just not going to be as cheap as it used to be, and there's fewer carriers that want to write it that we found.
The owner-flown jet and the owner-flown turboprop is where all the hand-to-hand fighting is. I mean, we're not just going back to them with increases. We're going back to them with limits that are cut in half, we're going back to them with quota share deals that like double their premium from the year before. It's just awful, and it's sort of a failure of the business to get this far behind the curve, the insurance business to get this far behind the curve, that we can't provide the product at a reasonable price. All of these things, all these cycles that we see in our business are driven by real things, by real losses. And there are plenty of, most of my turbine customers have had some kind of claim, and it's run into a lot of money. And all of a sudden, we're all these years down the road, suddenly waking up to the fact that we haven't made money in 10 years, and we're going to try and make it all back this year on this renewal. So it's fairly tough.
What can somebody do to make themselves, protect themselves from an insurance standpoint? They want to stay insured. They want to try to keep their rates as low as possible. They want to make themselves look good. And I'm talking training, maybe making the right choices in airplanes. What advice might you have?
So I always start out when I get a really rambunctious student that has 10 hours that wants to jump into an SR-22, and that is, you crawl before you walk, and you walk before you run. And somebody that understands that, I think, is my perfect customer, or the type of risk that I want to take a chance on. Continuous training. We find that people that continuously train have way better loss records than someone that, commercial pilot with 5,000 hours that isn't flying, or only flying, 20 hours a year. We started a safety rewards program actually to try and get people to continuously fly. And I can tell you that not 100% of our policyholders take us up on it. I find that pilots will spend hundreds of dollars perfecting their golf swing, but won't jump in an airplane with the CFI and go practice landings. And that would be my dream for every pilot to, like, every 60 days jump in an airplane and practice a landing. My life would be wonderful if that happened. So I wish.
Scott, what do you tell your clients to develop good habits from an insurer standpoint?
Well, I kind of tell them from, like, what I do in my seminars is that it used to be 100 hours we expected to fly a year. Then it was 55. And now we're seeing pilots that are flying light twins and high performance airplanes, and they're flying 15 to 25 hours a year. So my big thing is saying, you got to go fly. The big thing is get in the airplane and fly. Don't let it sit. And we do see that. We're seeing pilots that'll fly a 5-hour flight, then they'll set for months before they fly the next flight. And I think that falls back, and I think what Marcy was saying is training. They don't like to train. They don't like anybody telling them what to do, so they won't go get training. But so I tell them, if you're going to keep your costs down, buy fixed gear, keep it a simple airplane in the grand scheme of things. You want it as simple and easy to fly as possible. Get your instrument rating. And I even tell people I'm the perfect example of what not to be. I'm single engine, multi-engine, no instrument rating. And it's basically, I don't fly that anymore, those kind of airplanes, because it's too hard. You need an instrument if you're going to move up the ladder, and then go back to hours and be prepared to be where you are by 69 or 70. You need to probably be thinking about, that's what I'm going to fly for the rest of my career. And then if it is a complex airplane, start asking a lot of questions of your broker to get them to find out, well, are you going to make me do an annual flight review? Are you going to make me do an annual medical? Are they going to ask for a co-pilot? Start looking ahead at those kind of things to do it. But again, I just had an email yesterday to a guy, and we said, the key, he said, well, I want to do all this training. I don't want to do that. And I said, a lot of the companies aren't really giving you a lot of credit for trainings in light aircraft, but it's good for you. It's good to keep you current. But the other thing is just go out and fly and add the hours. It's, an hour a month is not enough. You need to go out and fly on a regular basis. I think Marcy's right. Go out and fly with a CFI, do some training, keep recurrent. And if not, I think the underwriters are going to get the point they're going to make you do that. We've already had underwriters get some of our light twin pilots to say, okay, you got to do an annual flight review in the airplane with emergency single engine performance. Well, why'd they do that? Because the guy's not flying enough. The pilot's not putting enough hours in. They're going to force you to do it. and we don't want to be forced to do it. So go out and get an airplane you're going to fly for a long period. Another thing, if you're old, I shouldn't say old, if you're an older pilot, but if you're an older pilot, you might think about changing airplanes. If you're flying a Baron or a 310 or a 340 or a 421, maybe I should think about backing off to a single engine. Maybe I go to a turboprop. Maybe I go to a Cirrus. And you never know what's going to happen. I had an 83-year-old, 84-year-old in a Cirrus flying 100 hours a year. So it's not late. He's not flying a lot. And the carrier he had canceled it, which shocked us. They did a non-renewal on us, and we had nowhere else to go. No one wanted to pick him up because he's in his 80s flying a Cirrus. And I finally got a quote for liability only, which was ridiculously high. And I gave him the option, and he said he's going to go uninsured, which is a terrible way to put a person flying that airplane into that position. No one would cover him. And that's something the underwriters did and that company. And it makes it hard for the customer. But I think that is another thing that we have to bring up to the customer is that, okay, if you're going to own an airplane, you got to think ahead. What's going to happen down the road? How long are you going to fly? And I've had other guys. I had a 76-year-old flying a twin, and he just said, I'm done. His wife flies. He says, I'm not even going to renew my medical anymore. I'll let her fly. And so those decisions a pilot has to make, and that's stuff I think we need to remind people, plan ahead.
What are you seeing in the light sports segment?
More of the same. I think the thing that aggravates the situation a little bit with light sport is, in many cases, getting replacement parts is very difficult.
I had an airline pilot call me. He was retiring and he was buying a light sport airplane. And at the time we had just changed the guidelines to say, even though you have 20,000 hours, you've got to get the 5 hours of dual plus a flight review in the airplane. And that was his sticking point. And it got to the point where I said, either take it or leave it. And he took it, but he called me the next week and said, I want to thank you because I was humbled in the first hour of flight in that airplane. And I don't know, I just remember that because it spoke volumes. Pilots don't usually call back and say, hey, thanks, but this guy did. And it's just something I remember.
And we have a flight school with one of the original Piper Sports, and people keep damaging the main landing gear. And every time it takes 4 to 6 months to get replacement parts so the airplane can go back to work. So yeah, I think that they're a real issue. And I would chime in with these guys. I think the main thing our customers need to do more of is they need to fly more. The other thing I would add is in Marcy's vein of training is look at the FAA Wings program. Go to your underwriter every year with some time under your belt in your airplane, with a couple of training events along the way, and a wings phase. And then your underwriter looks at you and says, okay, you're staying current. You're still in the game, and we'll give you a renewal quote.
So Avemco sponsors the wings program, and we pay for those wings, and we send out, I just did it the other day. Since we started 10 years ago, we've sent out 22,000 wings. So kudos to those folks that are out there earning their wings.
On that, a lot of the customers that have the normal 172 categories are getting computer generated quotes that you plug in, and they don't have necessarily the ability to go to the underwriter and say, hey, this guy's been doing all this, keep him insured. They typically just go through the process and go through the system. But if there's a question or a person is having a transition to a different airplane, I think the training is going to be important. Hey, look, he's doing this, he's doing that. Let's keep him insured, or let's move him to a different airplane. But again, flying, I think that's the biggest thing we see is keep the flying going, do some training every year, consistently go out and get hours built up on the airplane, and make sure you talk to people before you go out and buy a new one. Get quotes, ask questions, see what's available. As a comment about John Doolittle and the sport planes, that's something we found is I even have a Piper Sport customer who he put his back in an experimental category because he couldn't get parts for it. And so they were having to make parts, which then he took it out of and not a commercial basis, of course, but he put it back in experimental category where he could keep it maintained and flying because he couldn't get parts. And that's not the only airplane. I mean, there's other airplanes out there that are having trouble on the light sport category. that has just made it very difficult. I've got a guy with a Skycatcher did the same thing, waited months and months and months just to get updates on avionics, trying to get some help on that because it's made it very difficult. There's good airplanes, but they have, and I think that affects our rates too. We've had a problem with some of the experimentals that they can't get parts from the factory, whatever the reason. And so they're changing their underwriting ideas on it because they can't get parts. They have to total the airplane, do a constructive total loss instead of repairing it. And that's not probably the best for the insurance company or the customer, so those things have an effect on it. So probably in one of my closing things, buy a popular airplane, especially in the kit supply market, buy something that's got a lot of models out there. Don't do the one of a kinds unless you're prepared for that. You're just going to do something that's normal, regular, a lot of them.
Now, you can read more about the current insurance market in the November 2020 issue of Kit Planes Magazine and then the September 2020 issue of sister publication Aviation Consumer.